Hi, everyone. Really pleased to have Daniel or Dan. Is it Daniel or Dan?
Either works. So
Either works. With me today, and we're going to talk about progressing your career into commercial leadership. I'm going to introduce myself, and then I'll hand over to Dan. And I would say also commercial leadership within a high growth, tech-driven environment. And Dan can share more about his career. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Rich. I used to work at McKinsey. I've become an entrepreneur, and one of the businesses I co-founded is MoveMeOn.com. It's used by hundreds of thousands of professional services people to discover opportunities and discover career powering content. If you don't know the platform, it's free to use. Check it out at MoveMeOn.com. So that's me. Over to you, Dan, for a quick intro.
Yeah, great. Nice to be with you, Rich. Daniel Philbin Bowman, the full long name. So Dan's definitely easier. Originally from Dublin, went to Trinity College, went into McKinsey straight out of university as a BA and then associate. And since leaving McKinsey, have done three different sort of commercial growth roles, to Rich's point, at different stages of startups. So a very left McKinsey to join, be the first employee of a new startup in a kind of leadership development tech space, and ran product and business development there for a few years. Then actually, was in London and moved to New York with that company. Ultimately left to join a Series C marketplace business, running their B2B and partnerships business over in the States. And most recently went and took a chief commercial officer of a sort of, again, slightly earlier stage biotech marketplace startup as well in the States. So I've done sort of various different versions of commercial growth, BD, and some product at Series C to Series C startups.
Awesome. And that's a super popular topic I get asked about all the time, Dan. So this is going to be super relevant, joining that growth, startup, scale up tech space, and B, how to move from consulting or strategy into a more, let's say, P&L leadership oriented role. So that's what we're going to dive into today, folks. I'm going to fire some questions at Dan for the next 10, 15 minutes, and hopefully you'll be able to learn from his experience. So I guess, Dan, thinking back to consulting days, there's a whole bunch of skills that you get taught and you learn organically. If you think about your transition from consulting into chief commercial officer most recently, what have been the kind of consulting skills that have really helped you that people should focus on developing if they want to stand out and move through their career?
Yeah, well, I guess there's definitely no silver bullet, but from my experience, and it's probably a little bit of a cliche, but that core problem solving, breaking down the issue, doing out your issue tree, or I guess maybe different firms have different terms for it. At or near the beginning of a big task, still I use very, very regularly. I think the world sometimes in consulting projects can be messy. The world certainly outside of consulting projects is very messy. You could, in theory, when you're coming into, especially an early stage business, that you could be doing anything. And that's overwhelming and not particularly helpful, because you'll just get stuck either going down some rabbit holes or never even going there, because you're just mildly evaluating a ton of different pieces. And so just continuing to use, okay, what are the biggest drivers? Of course in startups, you're probably not doing the level of analytics and modeling that you're doing in consulting, because frankly often you just don't have the data or the numbers that are that rich. But just being able to put some back of the envelope stuff, almost closer to an interview in consulting, and then putting those numbers behind your issue tree, I think that's still incredibly helpful, and often is something you bring to the team in a startup environment where maybe folks that you're working with haven't done consulting, don't have that. They might be just deep operational people, and so, or deep commercial sales people. So they see a problem, they'll immediately just tend to put their experience on top of that and go out, oh, it must be like that, we therefore must do this exact sales pitch, or we must do this exact operational plan. And I think having the okay, let's take a step back, what are the different components of this? Maybe then 3 layers into your tree, we're bringing in that sales plan, and it's really useful to have someone who's deep experience of it. But being able to like plot it all, I think is really helpful. Also keep people a little kind of calm when maybe it's getting stressful or it is overwhelming. People don't know where to go. Just staying calm, going back to that, like, that mapped world. It probably is a cliche, but I think the more you do that in consulting and the more you bring that, it's hard to think of a situation where it's not useful.
Yeah, and it's sort of so ingrained into your consulting training that I think when you're outside consulting, you maybe don't appreciate what a kind of ninja skill it actually is, right? It's kind of second nature.
Yeah, I was even thinking it was kind of weird to say it as an answer because it's so sort of meta that I just use it without thinking. And so sometimes at the beginning, actually, when I left consulting, I didn't think it needed to be, if you like, spelled out. I just sort of went and did stuff in that way. But I think one of the learnings you get when you're in the real world is that, like, it is actually really helpful to map it out. And so I think at nearly every different startup I've been at, I've ended up running or being part of a faculty running like internal workshops for colleagues on like some of those core skill sets. And like, consultants by no means know everything or have it all figured out, but on that specific set of kind of skills and toolkit, I think it is really helpful to share those. And also when you have to go back and share them like 2-3 years later, you obviously freshen up a little bit, and you get sharper yourself, because teaching, is obviously a really good way to make sure you're practicing it.
And you've talked a little bit there about kind of leaving consulting in the different environments, right? So you talked about the kind of ambiguity and the chaos. So like, what are the biggest shocks or surprises that hit you when you joined, that first startup? And then maybe a follow-on question might be, as you move to the Series C, how different are those environments between like, very early stage and, much more established, VC backed, quite late stage, frankly. What was the initial shock? And then maybe if you could contrast the small startup versus the scale up.
Yeah. One of the things I remember being really shocked at was that in consulting, especially when you're like an analyst and associate, you're sort of like doing a good job is like being super comprehensive and super responsive. So an EM or a partner, maybe you're in the middle, an hour-long problem solving, you're mainly talking about like issue A, but issue B and C were referenced, put down at the bottom of the page to come back to. Like a good analyst associate, like, will have remembered that, will maybe, in their summary, talk about A, but then say, here are some thought, additional thoughts of how we go back to B and C and how we can figure out, even if they're tricky things that, might slow you down, you're really like, you're being rewarded, and what you're there for is to be comprehensive and to really find problems and then find solutions. When you're in a startup, and especially when you're like in a kind of mode where you're trying to grow with clients, so whether that's B2B like direct sales, or through partnerships, or even B2C where you're working with multiple agencies and you're kind of navigating that whole world, very often you want to get like very quickly to something that's going and moving. And so I remember, you might be in a pitch, and you're effectively trying to sell something. And so the client or the prospective client mentions maybe, 5 things. 2 of those things might be actually quite tricky things for you to deal with. But they've kind of moved on. And in your summary stuff, you actually don't necessarily want to like go, let's double click on those things. Let's like set up a session to problem solve on it. Like maybe they mentioned it, they didn't actually care that much about it. They kind of were ready to move on. You want to move on too, because that's suddenly in your interest, and you haven't more of an MVP probably approach. So you don't have everything ready to go. That's a weird thing to get out of the habit of, because suddenly you're trying to like, you're more like a sheepdog trying to like get this over the line as quickly as possible and then build on from there. Whereas I think in consulting, you're like, let's map out everything. Let's make sure every box is checked. Let's really be comprehensive. Which, you would think that's better. But that I think in the world, and then both internally, like even in, forget about the client side, you're just developing products. Like if you're really comprehensive about every single thing that's not ready, you'll never get the MVP out the door. And so you again need to be, quite 80-20. I guess 80-20 is something you do get from consulting, but you're applying it, I think, in a much more ruthless way in the non-consulting world.
Yeah.
At least, sorry, in the startup world. It doesn't, of course, like people going to government or bigger corporations, probably not the same, but you have to be really lean in that startup world and like do it iteratively.
Yeah, it's I was going to say iterating and getting something done. It's those incremental little steps. Whereas in consulting, you kind of, like you say, you map everything out, and then when everybody's happy there, then you kind of move forward. So yeah, it's a really different mindset shift. And how about when you move to like the second role in the US that you talked about? Like, what were the differences there, or what were the surprises when you joined, let's say, more established Series C maturing tech business?
Yeah. I think one of the reasons I did that was, I felt I learned a lot in consulting. We did a lot from first principles in that first seed stage company. Like, it was a bunch of really talented, great people, and we were doing stuff like we knew about, and so we were able to develop a lot from first principles and really, be reasonably successful. I think what we didn't have great experience, so none of us were like technologists and like true product people in that tech world. And obviously, consulting is not that, although it's becoming a little bit more like that, but it's not that. So when I went to that Series C company, they were a true tech company, and sort of being able to, they wanted me, so that was great. They wanted me for a bunch of the commercial stuff, like the structured thinking, the B2B growth, but they were also a really successful, well-run organization, and especially on that, like how do you build product, how do you ship features, how do you run sprints with your engineers, your product team? How do you feed that back to clients? So just going right in at a place that really knew how to do what it did at its core very well, like it's humbling, and you learn a lot from that and being surrounded by that. So for me, that was like something I clearly didn't have experience of before. And so like I was like, it was amazing to be able to be in the middle of that environment, seeing how it worked, being part of it, pick up that skill. From a play, from whereas like that's clearly something consulting just doesn't have. Now, there are actually overlaps, I would say. I think product in tech is one of these great black box like functions that people can overhype and think, well, I could never do that. I actually think a lot of consultants can be very, very successful at it. But for me to be successful at it, I knew I needed to learn from people who have really like cracked it, and the place I went, Handy and Angie, had really done that. So that was like a big difference.
Yeah, so really kind of being part of a product-led kind of business, if you like. Is there anything like really specific you'd put your finger on in terms of your learning there?
I mean, I think well, the real thing that they did really well at Handy was like it's kind of a bit boring, but like just like execution, like day to day, week to week, they had like really figured out, and this was like led by the CEO, who really never left being the chief product officer as well as being CEO, of like how do you tightly manage each thing, and how do you be ruthless about what you don't do, make sure you actually get stuff done at the end of the week. How do you have the right meetings? I mean, we used to have this one meeting, which some people thought was crazy. If you think about how much people, it was like the top 25 people in the company. Say there was like 100 people in the company, top 25 people for 90 minutes every Tuesday morning. We'd all be in a room and like going through our own summary of stuff, but anyone would be able to challenge anyone else. And you would therefore need to be able to sort of explain the triple click thing on your page 7 of like why exactly this thing happened. And that was generally very kind of effective management, but particularly for that link between like we're building product and tech, and there are clients and like customers who are using it. And so having that like interface directly all the time between commercial, product, tech, I think, yeah, that was a really successful version. Now, you don't want to spend all day, every day with each other, because you need to be going and doing your own jobs. So what I kind of learned there is how do you calibrate, I guess, making sure there's enough touch points, and also letting people like have focus. For example, like I would not just come out of a meeting on a Wednesday that a client suggested some new feature and immediately be calling the my product counterpart to say, hey, let's stop what we're doing this week and add this new feature, this client really wants it. there would be a process, put that in, get it prioritized, do some like evaluation. Is this ready to go? If we really need it, sometimes we would turn something around in 2 weeks and drop other stuff, but you can't be doing that all the time. You'll just be running around in circles as a product team. And so there was a very healthy like calibration, collaboration, sometimes tension between commercial and product. And yeah, it's just seeing that in action is really helpful.
Yeah, it's amazing how much I've read about success of scaling up to do with ruthless deprioritization. I think consultants like to think themselves as good as prioritizing. Often that means working an 80-hour week. I now think of like deprioritizing and just keeping that focus on execution and everything joined up, but in a way that doesn't necessitate like a life of meetings, right? So
exactly. And again, it's an example where you're having to make those ruthless deprioritization decisions without the full amount of data, because you are in a startup, you're moving fast. And so just decision making, honestly, is also something that is different in a well-run startup than consulting, because you're not going to wait the extra 2 weeks for the extra set of analysis. You don't have time to wait, and you don't have time to spend money on someone doing the analysis. You're just going to make a decision. And I think at the beginning, probably my instinct was not quite analysis paralysis, but your consulting instincts are, well, I just don't feel comfortable making that decision because what if I'm wrong? It's like, we don't have enough data. And I think what you get in really well-run startups is like definitely caring about data. Like one of Handy's values, for example, was data beats opinion, but being willing to make a decision and then execute on it wholeheartedly in recognition that we're not at like 98-2 in terms of probability here. We're like probably best case at 90-10, more likely 80-20.
Yeah. And you've touched there on a few skills, like I guess I had a question around, as you've progressed your career into more and more senior levels, like what are the things that you think have helped done that? So for instance, you've talked about deprioritization, you've talked about that focused execution. What else have you picked up, or what do you think defines kind of good senior leaders in this, growth tech space?
Yeah, I mean, by no means have I sort of cracked it, and like still got lots of miles to go and all that stuff. So I think those two for sure. I think like doing your diligence on the people you're working with, especially the like your leaders, your mentors, is super important. I think like there are certain folks who are destined to be, founder CEOs who just like very strong conviction, have an idea, gonna go do it, and that's amazing. And there's lots of ex-consultants who do that and will do that. For me, I'm not necessarily that. I want to be involved in like a fast-growing, exciting space, but I want to be doing it collaboratively. And so for me, very clear, like I'm going to be doing that as part of a team. And so like, who are those folks? What are people bringing together? Like that's complementary, like someone maybe strong more on the technology side, more on the ops side, more on the commercial side. And so I think when you're thinking about what you do next, especially that moment after leaving consulting, I think that's really important. I think, something, you've said in the past, like sometimes when you're leaving consulting, you're so busy and you're sort of, you get one shiny thing that maybe is someone is in this company, and you want to try something different, and so you end up saying, this sounds good, let's just go and do it. I mean, I definitely did a version of that, but at least one thing I tried to do, and I still try to do, is like when you're at those junctures, give yourself a couple of options, like explore a couple of different versions of things, because probably most people are going to be like charming in the interview process if they want you, and most things are going to sound exciting. And so if you're not doing that, your chances of making a bad decision are just higher. And so, and I've definitely made some like suboptimal decisions along the way, both micro and also like, could I pick that firm over that firm, all that kind of stuff. So the other thing is like keeping yourself, just like checking in on yourself. I think the biggest risk if you're going to go from consulting to like startup world is not that the startup fails or like doesn't take off. Like you should just own that risk. That's the world you're getting into. The biggest is probably that you plateau and you stay there like 2 extra years than you needed to. So you've got to keep checking in. Like, are we hitting our goals? Is this really, if I was looking outside in, where I think we should be? Am I doing everything I can? Am I in the best position, like role, etc., for what I can do? Am I still learning? All those things. So I've been very rigorous, I guess, about on myself and using a network of people to make sure that that's happening. And that's honestly like caused me to like change roles sometimes, where you think, well, it's still going fine, it's still enjoyable, but like it's not really, maybe like the curve is slightly edged off or whatever. So I think for your own personal career development, that's super important. The other thing that probably you learn in consulting, but not hardly anyone, I think, not hardly anyone, but a lot of people don't often apply it as ruthlessly as they should, is because we're human beings and we work with people and we're used to like, we get all that stuff about like, will I be excited working with this person? Is it fun? Like those things are obviously really, really important, but that's all like kind of how you play stuff. But where to play, like what is the sector? What is the product? Are there like lots of tailwinds? It's structurally much more important. I mean, McKinsey, lots of other consultants have done many analyses showing like, you'd actually be better off owning shares or working, say, in like a 7 out of 10 company in a 8 or 9 out of 10 space than in a 10 out of 10 performing company in a like 5 or 6 out of 10 space. And so I think we often just get excited by people, ideas, stuff, teams. Like that definitely is important, because if you're with miserable people, you'll be miserable. But I think the more you can put yourself in structures and in like in sectors of the economy that are like just moving anyway, then what better than to be like in an 8 or 9 out of 10 company in an 8 or 9 out of 10 space.
And particularly, I think for progression, if that space is growing, if the business is growing, my experience has been that you then need to develop leadership quite quickly, because the organization has gone from 50 to 500 to 5,000, in a relatively short space of time. And having got in there sort of relatively early and built some trust, you can end up, being chucked into some pretty meaty roles, and those developing. Yeah. So I think it's a great example for me. Like for me, it's about knowing also where you like to spend time. So when you're in consulting, you think a lot about industry, right? So like oil and gas or financial services or, SaaS. When you leave consulting, I think it becomes much more about where you're most effective, right? So do you like working collaboratively with lots of people? Do you like spending loads of time in numbers? So the actual things you're doing become more and more important, and maybe less, for your own enjoyment and energy, and maybe less, am I doing an oil and gas project, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely, for sure. And I think that you still always are open to learning more about that. And yeah, for example, as you get a bit more senior, sometimes a classic divide is going to be like, is it the thing you love doing, that you just love being like designing the product or selling or operations, or do you actually like that but are good at and enjoy people management? Because obviously the more senior you get, the more of your time just gets spent on the more like managing of people, help facilitate other people doing it, coaching them. And I've seen that with peers, that's always like this tension. Because a lot of people, I think, well, I want to be more senior, and more senior means managing people, but that's not actually what helps them tick. And so then they're not really that happy, and they're just a bit bored. They aren't doing the thing that they want to do. So I think organizations are also getting better at like having paths for like, if you like senior experts or senior individual contributors, who maybe have some management, but not just like general management stuff.
Yeah, and they're very different skills, right? Just because you're an awesome salesperson doesn't mean you're going to be an awesome people manager as you become senior. And I guess one like closing question, and because you're from a consulting background, but equally I think this applies to people who are coming out of larger organizations, corporates. Is there anything you really miss having left that kind of bigger business world? What are people?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely, to have the solidity that you have in a bigger company, or in a consulting environment, where you're like, right, I don't massively need to worry about this working out in the next 3 months in very, very real like terms. I have like time and space to think through this, to do it comprehensively, to like get to the bottom of it. it's definitely that's like more intellectually satisfying to an extent, from one perspective. You're more fully engaging, comprehensively engaging with a problem, and you're probably spending more time thinking, like in that true sense of the word, versus you don't have time to do that, as we said. So like you're in the consulting world, you kind of making decisions on the fly, moving from one thing to the next, and you sort of, it's like what Alex Ferguson said. But it's like constantly squeaky bum time. You're like constantly like, okay, kind of gets it's less like, there's never really a moment if the company's growing that fast where you're like, great, let's just like chill, like solidly get this one right, and so maybe that's a bit more true on the commercial side. So yeah, for sure, I miss in that sort of like sense of just like getting stuck into a problem and really going at it and not needing to have it all like come together super quickly.
The luxury of time.
Yeah, I mean, but by the way, probably some consultants are being like, what is he talking about? Because you work where it's always a deadline. There's always like Tuesdays Steerco, and we're up to 1 a.m. on Monday, and like then the next thing and the next thing and the next thing. And that's pretty put in by consulting to like get really, really good work done. But when you compare the like level of rigor you're doing sometimes in those pieces to this, like how you might be dealing with in this startup, you're definitely going at it at a much higher and deeper level. Now, some people would argue like on different projects how useful that is or not, but you're definitely hitting it at a much more detailed level. So when you're actually spending your time on is more of that like thinking, analysis, like working it all through, problem solving, I guess. Whereas in the other world, you've probably done, you might still be working to 1 a.m., but you've probably done like 3 or 4 problems at a much lighter level in that time.
And there's that pressure of hitting numbers, or potentially having a runway where your cash is running out, and
right.
Shit's getting real, right? And consulting, particularly I think at the more junior levels, like pre-partner, you are quite insulated from that kind of commercial reality and pressure.
Yeah, exactly.
One little closing thing, and this has been great. I've really, really enjoyed it, and I think a whole bunch of interesting insights on the world of startup and scale up and going to New York and becoming, senior commercial leader. As you've been through that journey, are there any kind of resources you use? Like there's so much free learning nowadays, so blogs, podcasts, whatever comes to mind. Is there stuff that you'd recommend people dip into if they're interested in startups or scale ups or, commercial roles?
Yeah, I'm probably not like someone who's overused like the like classic framework stuff. Obviously I studied business in university, and then I feel like when you go into consulting, you kind of get your own version of the toolkit. So I for me, it's more important, like, are you staying relevant to your space? Are you staying relevant to your clients? Like what's interesting? Are you like, I think one of the great skills that a lot of consultants have is like matching and connecting like different thoughts and developments and innovations in different spaces and bringing them together. And I think just like, if you've got that mindset, like then making sure you're reading in like your client space. So like, I love The Economist. I read that all the time. I follow a bunch of people on like Medium and LinkedIn. Twitter, obviously slightly shorter and pithier, maybe less useful for some of these, but just like giving yourself, like whatever your area is, like, are you going to, maybe you don't want to do the writing itself, but could you write an interesting, like, 500-word piece of like, this is in this quarter in my space in like whatever SaaS for medical companies, like this is an interesting development. This is what I think the market's going to be like this time next year. That, like, what are the ingredients for you being able to write that? And I think it's like connecting dots, making sure you're current, and like bringing some original thoughts. So for me, that's more where I spent my time, rather than like this framework for this kind of thing from a more an academic setting.
Yeah. And protecting time to do that, right? It doesn't take hours a day, but you need a bit of discipline to keep up to date.
Yeah, exactly. Not doing it on your phone, probably, because you 17 notifications a minute distracting you from whatever you were supposed to be reading. So yeah.
Cool. Like, Dan, this has been great. I'm gonna let you head back to your afternoon, but I want to say thanks for joining me. I know a whole bunch of people will be interested in the spaces you've been working in, so we appreciate the time. And
awesome.
I was just going to say, if people enjoy these videos, then you can check out the other ones. If you're interested in this type of content, go find me on LinkedIn, Richard Rosser. And if you're not a MoveMeOn user, it's a free platform. Go check it out at movemeon.com. Cheers, Dan. Thanks again.
Bye.
Bye.